The door was still. Nara Vell sat in the dark of the roadside shelter with her knees drawn up and her back against the cold stone wall and her eyes open. Which was wrong. Her eyes were always closed during the 3 hours, had been closed every night for 17 years. Closed, and her awareness extended to the place she had no name for, the place where the door was, where the pressure lived, where she pressed. She was not pressing. She had not pressed last night either, or the night before. 3 nights now of sitting in the dark and finding, where the intention to press usually lived. Only the echo of Caden Morrow's voice in the kingdom's presentation circle. Precise and cold, and followed by laughter that had moved through the gallery like a wave she could still feel against her face. There is no gift here. There is only a woman who sits very still in the dark and calls it a contribution. The laughter. She pressed her palms flat against the stone floor of the shelter and felt nothing beneath them except cold rock. The door was somewhere to the east. She had always known the direction without being able to explain how she knew, and it was still in a way it had never been still before. Not quiet, still. The specific, loaded stillness of a held breath. She did not know yet what still meant. She pulled her coat tighter and waited for the morning, because the morning was the only thing she was certain of. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. She had been a records clerk for 4 years before she understood why she had chosen the position. The understanding had arrived not as insight, but as confirmation, the specific recognition of someone realizing that a decision they believed they had made for practical reasons had in fact been made by a deeper, less articulable part of themselves that had understood the requirements before the rational mind had finished asking the question. Records work finished at the 6th hour of the afternoon. It required nothing of the evening. It conflicted with nothing that happened between the 9th and 12th hours of the night, which were the hours she could not give to anyone else, which meant they were the hours that quietly, invisibly governed every other decision in her life. She had declined 6 evening invitations in the past month alone. The colleagues she worked alongside in the records office had developed a collective, affectionate theory about this, that she was privately religious, that the evening hours were devoted to some practice she was modest about. She had never confirmed or denied this. It was close enough to true that the denial would have been the more dishonest option, and close enough to unexplainable that the confirmation required no further detail. She accepted the theory with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that the world is very willing to supply its own explanations for the gaps you leave in your self-presentation, if you allow it the space to do so. The 3 hours themselves were not, from the outside, remarkable in any way that would have satisfied a curious observer. She sat. She closed her eyes. She was still for approximately 3 hours, after which she opened her eyes, drank whatever she had prepared in advance, and went to bed. The physical presentation of the practice was so unremarkable that on the 2 occasions when she had been interrupted, once by a neighbor's emergency, once by a fire alarm in the building that turned out to be a kitchen incident 2 floors above, the person who had interrupted her had not registered anything unusual about the state they had found her in. Sitting quietly, eyes closed, that was all that was visible. What was not visible was the extension. This was the word she had settled on after years of searching for language that was adequate without being dramatic, the extension of her awareness eastward, to the specific location she could not physically describe but could locate with the precision of a compass finding north, where the door was where she pressed. The pressing itself was effortful in a way that had no physical analog she had found, not muscular effort, not the effort of concentration in the conventional sense, but the specific, sustained effort of maintaining an intention at full intensity for 3 consecutive hours without the intention degrading into habit or distraction or the comfortable drift of unfocused awareness. Distraction weakened it. She had learned this early, and the learning had been frightening enough to make sustained focus a practice she had never treated casually. Emotional distress weakened it more significantly. This was the piece of knowledge she had carried the longest and the most carefully, the understanding that the pressing required a specific quality of interior stillness that acute feeling disrupted, that grief or rage or the particular, destabilizing distress of humiliation made the intention slip and the pressure on the other side of the door respond immediately to the slipping with the focused, Patient urgency of something that had been testing the seal for a very long time. She had organized her emotional life around this. Not suppression, she had tried suppression, and found it counterproductive. The contained feeling producing a specific interior turbulence that was worse for the pressing than the acknowledged feeling. Management was more accurate. The practiced, methodical approach to her own emotional responses that involved acknowledging what she felt, and then placing it carefully to one side during the 3 hours and returning to it afterward, with the unhurried attention of someone who trusts that what they have set aside will still be there when they come back. She had become, through necessity and practice, very good at this. What she had not been good at, what no amount of management had adequately prepared her for, was the specific combination of public humiliation and public laughter in a room full of people whose judgment she had been required to present herself to. Delivered by a voice with the authority to make the laughter feel like consensus rather than cruelty. She had felt the door the moment she walked out of the presentation circle. Had felt the pressure on the other side respond to the quality of what she was carrying, not with increased urgency. Not with the focused testing she had come to know as the riff's characteristic response to her distress, but with something different. Something that felt, in the specific interior language of 17 years of nightly contact, almost like recognition. As if it had been waiting for exactly this quality of disruption. As if it had known before she had, that this particular wound would be the one she could not set aside in 3 hours. She had walked out of the kingdom that evening. She had not pressed that night, or the next, or the next. On the morning of the presentation ceremony, she had felt the pressure shift. The 3 hours began the same way every night. She would sit, on her bed, on the floor, on whatever surface was available when the 9th hour arrived. Because she had learned early that the surface did not matter, and that the body's comfort was secondary to the intention's quality, and that no amount of physical preparation compensated for arriving at the practice with a distracted or turbulent interior. She would close her eyes. She would spend the first few minutes in the specific practice settling that she had developed over years, not meditation in any formal sense. Not any technique she had learned from a book or a teacher, but the personal, idiosyncratic process of a woman who had invented her own method for achieving a state that no existing method had been designed to produce. Then she would extend. The extension moved eastward, always eastward, with the compass-finding certainty she had stopped questioning years ago. It moved through walls, through the city, through the specific geography of the kingdom's eastern territories in a way that had no physical analog, passing through everything without being impeded by anything, until it reached the place. The location she could not describe to anyone who had not felt it, and which she suspected no living person had felt except herself. The door. It was not literally a door. She knew this, had known it since she was old enough to understand that the word was a convenience rather than a description. A shape her mind imposed on something that had no shape in any sense she could communicate. But the experience of it was so consistently, specifically door-like, that the word had become unavoidable. It was a barrier. It was a threshold. It was the specific, massive, cold presence of a boundary between what was and what was pressing to become. And it pressed. This was the thing she had never found language adequate for, the quality of the pressure on the other side. It was not mindless. She had understood this by the time she was 10. Young enough that the understanding had frightened her significantly, and old enough that she had been able to sit with the fright and continue pressing regardless, which was the specific, grim competence of a child who has been doing something frightening every night for 3 years and has developed the relationship with fear that sustained practice produces. The pressure had intelligence, or something that functioned like intelligence, a directedness, a testing quality. The specific patient probing of something that was looking for weakness rather than simply pushing against a surface. It tested the edges. It found the places where her intention was thinnest, the nights of exhaustion, the nights of distraction. The nights when something in her daily life had produced the emotional turbulence that weakened the pressing, and it applied its greatest force to those places. With the unhurried persistence of something that understood it had time. She had never given it an opening large enough to matter. 17 years. Not one night missed. Not one 3-hour session abandoned before the full duration was complete. She had pressed through illness, through grief, through the specific depleting exhaustion of her fourth consecutive year of the practice, when her body had staged a mild rebellion against the nightly expenditure, and she had learned to manage the exhaustion as simply another variable in the practice's maintenance. She had pressed through the deaths of both her parents in the same winter, performing the 3 hours each night with the tears still on her face, and the grief sitting in her chest like a stone, and the intention maintained through pure, stubborn will. She had pressed through every form of difficulty her life had produced. Tonight, an hour into the practice, the pressure shifted. This was new. In 17 years of nightly contact, the pressure had tested, had probed, had applied varying intensity to varying locations along the door's edges. But it had never shifted in quality in the middle of a session. The shift was subtle, a change in the pressure's direction, as if something on the other side had turned its attention from the door itself to the person pressing against it. She was being looked at. The specific quality of focused attention, directed at her rather than at the seal, was so unexpected that she nearly broke contact, the instinctive withdrawal of someone who has been observing something and has suddenly realized they are also being observed. She held, maintained the intention through the surprise and the unease, kept the pressing steady while the attention on the other side remained directed at her with the specific, assessing quality of something forming a calculation. Then it withdrew. The pressure returned to its usual pattern, testing, probing, patient, and she completed the final hour with the specific, heightened alertness of someone who has just understood that the situation they have been managing is more complicated than they believed. She sat with her eyes open afterward for a long time. The shift had happened the night before the presentation ceremony. She had not connected the two things consciously, not yet. But she had lain awake in the hours between the practice's end and the morning with the specific, unattributed unease of someone who has felt something change in a system they have been monitoring and has not yet identified what the change means. The morning had answered that question with the cold precision of Caden Morrow's voice in the presentation circle. She understood now what the attention had been: anticipation. The circle was marked in the kingdom's formal presentation hall with inlaid stone, a design 2 centuries old, originally intended to contain the energy output of high-intensity gifts during assessment. Now largely ceremonial, since most gifts assessed in the modern era did not produce measurable energy output at levels that required containment. Nara had stood inside it and felt the rift pressing against her consciousness from the east with the steady, patient urgency it always carried, and had understood immediately that the circle's containment function was irrelevant to what she did, because what she did produced no output. It only held. The court assessor was a man named Trell, credentialed and efficient, who had assessed 43 gifts in the past calendar year, and who approached each assessment with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned that visible enthusiasm for remarkable results and visible disappointment at unremarkable ones were both professionally inadvisable. He had placed his instruments around the circle's perimeter, the standard array, calibrated for the frequency ranges that the kingdom's documented supernatural gifts were known to operate within, and had asked her to demonstrate. She had done what she always did: closed her eyes, extended, pressed. The instruments had not moved. Trell had checked the calibration, had repositioned 2 of the sensors, had asked her to try again. She had tried again, maintaining the pressing with the full intention she brought to the nightly practice, and the instruments had remained as still as they had been before she started. The gallery had begun to make the specific, low, collective sound of an audience that has decided how it feels about something. Trell had delivered his assessment to the court with the professional care of someone trying to soften an outcome without misrepresenting it. No measurable output detected across any monitored frequency range, no evidence of active supernatural engagement. Recommendation that the presenting individual be reclassified as non-gifted for formal court purposes. Caden Morrow had been seated at the court's formal assessment position, elevated, visible, his expression carrying the controlled attention of a man performing his role with adequate care. She had looked at him when Trell delivered the assessment, not because she expected intervention, but because she had looked at his face when she entered the circle and had felt, in the specific interior register that she trusted more than any external signal, something that she was not going to examine during a formal presentation in front of the full court. He had looked at the gallery, at the 3 senior Alpha Council members who were present for this assessment session specifically, because they had been publicly critical of the king's appointment process, at the political landscape of the moment, which required a demonstration of rigorous standards. Then he had looked at her. "There is no gift here," he said, with the cold precision of a man making an example of something he has decided is an acceptable loss. "There is only a woman who sits very still in the dark and calls it a contribution." The laughter had been immediate. She had stood in the circle while it moved through the gallery, and she had pressed against the door the way she always pressed, and she had felt the pressure on the other side respond to what she was feeling with a quality she recognized: satisfaction. The flashback arrived now, on the road 3 days from the border, in the specific, uninvited way of formative memories. She had been 7 years old, and it had been the first night, the night her awareness had extended for the first time without her understanding what was happening. Finding the door with the terrified surprise of someone who has reached into a dark space and touched something enormous. She had pressed because the alternative, in that first moment of contact, had been unthinkable. Some instinct older than her understanding had known immediately that the door needed to be held, and that she was the one holding it. In the morning she had gone to her mother in the kitchen, and had said, with the careful, serious precision of a 7-year-old reporting something important, "There is a door and something is pressing against it from the other side, and I have to hold it closed every night." Her mother had looked at her with the expression of someone managing a child's anxious imagination. Had said, "It was a dream, Nara." Had said, "You have always had vivid dreams." Had returned to the morning's work with the unhurried confidence of someone who has classified a thing and is done with it. Nara had gone back to her room. Had understood, with the specific, devastating clarity available to 7-year-olds who are paying very close attention, that she would not be believed. She had pressed every night since without telling anyone. Now 3 days past the border, she felt the door in the east, still, as it had been still for 3 nights, and felt, beneath the stillness, the first faint, terrible suggestion of movement. The first report came from a village called Endra. It was a small settlement in the Eastern Territories interior, far enough from the capital that its communications arrived at the Central Administrative Office with a 2-day delay built into the standard courier route, which meant that when the report landed on the desk of the kingdom's supernatural emergency coordinator on a Thursday morning, the events it described had already occurred on a Tuesday. The coordinator, a woman named Sable, experienced and methodical, who had spent 15 years managing the kingdom's supernatural event registry without once processing a report that required genuine emergency response, read it twice before she filed it. Class 1 Rift Activity. Unconfirmed. The designation existed in the registry's classification system as a theoretical category, something the system's architects had included for completeness rather than anticipated use. In the 15 years Sable had been managing the registry, it had never been applied to an actual event. She applied it now with the specific, careful attention of someone who understands that a category being used for the first time requires particular precision, because the first application becomes the precedent for all subsequent ones. The events at Endra were minor. An unusual cold in the village's eastern quarter that persisted regardless of weather conditions, and that the villagers described as not quite temperature, more like the absence of something that should be present. A quality of wrongness in the air that affected the way sound moved and the way light fell rather than the thermometer reading. Several animals in the eastern quarter refusing to enter their usual shelters, congregating instead at the settlement's western boundary with the specific, sustained behavioral disruption that the registry's reference materials described as one of the earliest indicators of Class 1 Rift activity. A child reporting that she could see through her own hand, only for a moment, and only once, and only in the eastern quarter at the specific location where the cold was strongest. The child's parents had dismissed it. The child had described it to the village's appointed supernatural monitor with the specific, serious precision of someone reporting something they had actually seen, and the monitor had included it in the report with the professional conscientiousness of someone who understood that their role was to document rather than to assess. Sable had cross-referenced the Endra report against the registry's historical documentation of the Dark Rift. The historical record was extensive and largely theoretical. The rift had been sealed for 3 centuries. and the documentation of its sealed state described an entity that produced no active effects. No measurable disturbances, no Class 1 indicators of any kind. The record of its pre-sealing state, compiled from the original accounts of the summoning ritual's aftermath, described effects of considerably greater magnitude than a persistent cold and a child seeing through her hand. She had filed the report, flagged it for follow-up monitoring, continued her day. The second report arrived the following morning from a different village 30 miles further north. The third arrived before she had finished reading the second. By the end of the week, she had 7 reports from 5 different settlements, all in the Eastern Territory's interior, all describing variations on the same cluster of phenomena, all bearing the same directional quality, the effects concentrated in the eastern portions of each settlement, as if something to the east of everything was producing a disturbance that weakened as it traveled west. She had upgraded the classification to Class 1 Rift Activity Confirmed. She had sent the full file to the kingdom's head seer. She had notified the Supernatural Emergency Council's Standing Committee. She had done all of this with the methodical efficiency of her training. And then she had sat at her desk in the late afternoon quiet of the administrative office and looked at the map she had marked with the 7 settlement locations and felt, in the way that experienced practitioners of any discipline sometimes feel things before they can articulate why, that the scale of what she was looking at was larger than the classification system's current tier structure was designed to accommodate. In the capital, the reports reached Caden through the standard intelligence briefing on a Friday morning, a single paragraph at the end of the Eastern Territory section, summarized by the briefing staff as minor supernatural anomalies under investigation, Eastern Territory Interior. He had read it with the practiced attention he brought to briefings and moved on to the next item, because the briefing staff summary had communicated no urgency and he had no framework, yet, for understanding that the minor and the unprecedented were the same thing. On Friday evening, after the court's business was concluded, he had walked through the presentation hall on his way to his study and had stopped, without planning to stop, beside the inlaid stone circle at the room's center, had stood in it for a moment, the first time he had stood in it since the assessment session, the first time since the words and the laughter. The circle was empty and cold, and the hall was quiet. He had not thought about what he said to her since the day he said it. He thought about it now briefly, in the way that things you have not examined sometimes surface when you stand in the location where they happened. He did not examine it for long. He moved on. On Saturday morning, a personal message arrived from the kingdom's head seer, bypassing the standard intelligence channel. Bearing no official seal and no routing documentation, the kind of communication sent when the sender has decided that official channels are too slow or too visible for what needs to be said. He read it standing at his desk. The message was 4 sentences. The final sentence was the one that did not leave him. Something was holding this back, and it has stopped. The date the holding stopped corresponds to the night of the presentation of the gifted. We need to speak immediately. Come alone. Voss did not stand when he entered. This was notable. The head seer of the kingdom's supernatural intelligence division had been in her position for 40 years and had received 3 kings in that time. And in Caden's experience, she had always received him with the formal standing that protocol required. Tonight she was sitting at the long table in the seer house's working room, surrounded by maps and documentation, and the specific organized disorder of someone who had been working continuously for several days without the administrative luxury of tidying between tasks. And she looked up at him when he entered with the expression of a woman who has decided that the situation has exceeded the relevance of protocol. He sat across from her without being invited to sit, because the alternative was standing while she explained something he already understood would require him to be sitting. She began with the timeline. She had assembled it with the specific, rigorous precision of 40 years of evidence-based practice, each data point sourced, dated, cross-referenced against independent reports from multiple locations. The Dark Rift's sealed state had maintained perfect stability for 3 centuries, producing no measurable disturbance, no Class 1 indicators, no variation of any kind from the baseline documented when the seal was last formally assessed 4 generations ago. The timeline of the current deterioration began on a specific night. She placed the date on the table between them, written in her careful hand, and had proceeded at a rate of acceleration that her models had not initially been calibrated to predict, because her models had been built on the assumption that the sealed state was the rift's natural condition, rather than a maintained one. "The sealed state is not natural," she said, with the flat clarity of someone delivering a correction to a foundational assumption. "It has been maintained, continuously, by someone, applying sustained supernatural pressure to the rift's structure every night for a period that my analysis of the deterioration rate suggests is approximately 17 years. Caden was very still. "The maintenance has ceased," she continued. "The cessation was abrupt. Not gradual, not the degradation you would expect from someone losing the ability to maintain a practice, but the sharp cutoff of someone who simply stopped. The date of the cessation corresponds precisely to the night of the presentation of the gifted." She looked at him across the table with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has been maintaining professional courtesy for a long time and has made a specific decision to stop. The last documented individual to enter the presentation circle that evening who has not been accounted for in the capital since is an Omega Records clerk named Nara Vell. The court register records her gift assessment as negative and her status as non-gifted. The instruments did not detect. "The instruments are calibrated for gifts that produce output," Voss said. The patience in her voice was the professional patience of someone who has explained a technical limitation to a non-technical authority before and who has accepted that the explanation will need to be made several times before it is fully received. The anchor gift produces no output. It consumes. It takes the practitioner's intention and focuses it entirely on containment. Nothing is released. Nothing is measurable by any instrument designed to detect release. We have had no living anchor in 4 generations. The instruments have never been calibrated for the anchor because we had no evidence the anchor still existed. A pause. We had evidence. We chose not to call it evidence. He sat with this. She gave him the time to sit with it, which he appreciated and did not show. "The deterioration is accelerating," she continued, moving to the map. "The current rate projects Class 2 activity within 3 weeks. Class 3 within 5. Class 3 rift activity, for your reference, is the classification used in the historical record to describe the period immediately preceding the original sealing, the period in which the Eastern Territory was experiencing direct incursion events." She placed her finger on the map at the Eastern Territory's interior. "We are not at Class 3. We have time. But the window is not indefinite, and it is contracting." "What restores the seal?" "The anchor returns to the practice." She looked at him. "Nara Vell returns to the practice." He was quiet for a long moment. The working room was lit by several lamps, and in their combined light, the maps and documentation spread across the table had the specific, weighted quality of things that matter, not the administrative weight of important documents, but the older, heavier weight of things on which the physical safety of a large number of people depends. "How long do I have to find her?" Voss considered the question with the honest deliberation of someone who is not going to give him an answer more comfortable than the evidence supports. "If she resumes the practice at the maintenance level, the nightly 3 hours, within the next 10 days, the deterioration should stabilize and begin to reverse. The rift does not recover instantly from cessation, but the anchor's return arrests the progression." She paused. "If she does not resume within 10 days, the deterioration will have progressed to a point where maintenance-level practice may be insufficient to stabilize it. At that point, we would be looking at a more significant intervention." "What does a more significant intervention mean?" Voss looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was not the expression of someone withholding information. It was the expression of someone deciding how to present information that will land badly regardless of how it is presented. "It means the anchor gift has a second mode," she said carefully. "One that has not been used in recorded history. One that I suspect Nara Vell does not know exists." Another pause. "Find her, Your Majesty. Bring her back. Explain to her what was explained to you tonight. And include in that explanation a complete account of what happened in the presentation circle and who is responsible for her departure." He stood. "How far across the border?" "The residual energy signature from her practice suggests she has not gone further than 3 to 4 days of travel." Voss looked at the map. She is not running from the kingdom. She is walking away from it. There is a difference. He left before dawn. Not with the full apparatus that a royal pursuit technically warranted, the diplomatic protocols, the formal border crossing documentation, the advisory staff and security detail, and administrative personnel that official kingdom business beyond the border was supposed to require. He had reduced this to 3 riders, Voss's most experienced field seer, and himself. And he had made this reduction not from impatience with protocol, but from the specific, private understanding that arriving at Nara Vell's location with the full weight of royal institutional infrastructure was the wrong approach to the conversation he needed to have.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
He had given himself one honest assessment of the situation in the hour before departure. Standing in his study in the dark with Voss's documentation spread across his desk. The assessment was this. He had said something publicly that had made it impossible for the most important supernatural practitioner in the kingdom to continue her practice. The impossibility had not been mechanical. She had not lost the ability to press. The distress had been sufficient to disrupt the concentration required. He had disrupted it with a sentence and a court's laughter, and the disruption had sent her across the border, and the seal had begun to fail. And the failure was measurable and accelerating and entirely, specifically traceable to the moment his words had left his mouth. He had not thought about her since the ceremony. This was not cruelty, it was the specific, comfortable inattention of a man whose world was large enough that a single administrative decision in the form of a spoken assessment could fall below the threshold of subsequent consideration. He had said the words. The ceremony had continued. The council members in the gallery had been satisfied with the demonstration of rigorous standards. He had moved to the next item. She had moved to the border. He rode south and east through the first day with the focused urgency of someone who has accepted. That speed is necessary without pretending that speed is sufficient. The riding gave him time that he would have filled, under ordinary circumstances, with briefings and decisions, and the continuous administrative present that a king's schedule was designed to maintain. There were no briefings on horseback at dawn. There was only the road and the specific, uncomfortable interior of a man who had stopped managing his own thinking. He thought about what she had been doing. 17 years, Voss had estimated 17 years, based on the deterioration rate of 3 hours every night alone, pressing against something that the kingdom's most sophisticated supernatural instruments could not detect. The pressing had kept the Eastern Territory safe, had kept the rift sealed, had kept the Class 1 indicators from appearing, had kept the Class 3 incursion events of 3 centuries ago from recurring, had protected the lives and land of everyone in the Eastern Territory without any of them knowing they were being protected or by whom. She had been doing this since she was approximately 7 years old. He followed this calculation to its endpoint without allowing himself to stop at the more comfortable intermediate stops. 7 years old. A child. A child who had felt the door and pressed without being asked, without being trained, without any institutional support or acknowledgement or even basic understanding of what she was doing and why it mattered. A child who had told no one because no one had believed her. Who had pressed every night for 17 years in the specific, invisible way of people who carry essential responsibilities that the world's accounting systems are not designed to see. And he had stood in the presentation circle and told a room full of people that there was no gift there. He rode through the second day with the reckoning fully present and not being managed, which was not a comfortable way to spend a day in the saddle, but which was, he had decided, the appropriate condition for the journey. He did not deserve comfort on this road. He could have comfort when he had done what the road required. On the second evening, the field seer, a woman named Aldrit, who had been tracking the residual energy signature Voss had identified, confirmed that they were within 2 days of Nara's current location. She described the signature with the technical precision of her training. But at the end of the description, she added something that was not technical, delivered in the quieter register of personal observation rather than professional report. The signature is stable, she said. She is staying in one location. She is not running further. A pause. But she is also not pressing. I can feel the absence of the practice in the residual pattern. She has not resumed. He had expected this, and it did not make it easier to sit with. On the third morning, they reached the shelter where she had spent her first 3 nights across the border. Aldrich took him inside, and he stood in the small, cold space and looked at the marks she had left, the specific arrangement of her few belongings' placement. Visible in the dust, the particular spot against the eastern wall where she had sat. Against the eastern wall. He stood in the shelter and looked at the marks on the floor where she had sat with her back against the eastern wall for 3 nights. And he understood something he had not understood from Voss's documentation alone. She had sat here, across the border, exhausted and humiliated, and she had still been sitting toward it. Still facing the direction of the door, even when she was not pressing. Even in the cessation, some part of her had been oriented toward the thing she had spent 17 years holding. Aldrich was watching him from the doorway. 2 days, she said quietly. The signature is stronger to the south. She has moved to a village. He nodded, walked back to his horse. He had been thinking for 3 days about what he was going to say to her. He had drafts of it in his head, various openings, various framings, various arrangements of acknowledgement and urgency and request. None of them were adequate. He was beginning to understand that adequate was not available to him for this conversation, and that the correct approach was therefore not to find the adequate version, but to arrive without one and say the true thing in whatever form it took when he was standing in front of her. He mounted and rode south. She was carrying stones when he arrived. Not metaphorically, she had found work at a construction site at the village's eastern edge, hauling building material from a supply pile to the foundation area of a new storehouse. And she was in the middle of her 3rd trip of the morning when the sound of horses on the village's main road made her stop and look up. 4 horses, one of them bearing a rider whose posture she recognized before she could see his face. She set the stone down, straightened, wiped her hands on the work cloth she had tied at her waist. He dismounted at the road's edge and crossed the construction site toward her on foot, alone, leaving the 3 riders and the seer woman at the road. He was not wearing anything that announced his position, no insignia, no formal coat, nothing that would communicate his rank to the village workers who had paused their own work to observe the arrival of 4 horses with the practical attention of people for whom unusual events carry potential significance. He looked like a man who had been riding for several days and had not been sleeping adequately, which was what he was. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him with the level, unhurried attention she brought to significant things and waited for him to speak. Because she had decided on the walk to work that morning that if he found her, which she had understood, since the 3rd night across the border, was a question of when rather than whether, she would not make it easier than it was. Which meant she would not fill the silence he needed to begin. He began. The dark rift is opening. Flat, direct, without preamble. He had decided the same thing she had, apparently, about the inadequacy of framings. 3 nights after you stopped. The first signs appeared in the Eastern Territory. Voss, the head seer, traced the deterioration to the exact night of the ceremony. The exact night. A pause. She explained what the anchor gift is. What you have been doing. For how long? 17 years, Nara said. 17 years. And the kingdom's instruments never detected it in any of those 17 years. No. And the first time the kingdom had an opportunity to formally assess my gift, the assessment found nothing, and the court's response was to laugh. He held the eye contact with the steadiness of someone who has decided that looking away is not available to them. Yes. The construction site was quiet around them. The other workers had made the collective, practical decision to find reasons to be elsewhere, which was the village common sense of people who recognized a conversation that required privacy and were extending it without being asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, tell me about the rift. Specifically, what is happening and at what rate? He told her everything Voss had told him, with the specific detail and the timeline and the projected escalation and the 10-day window for maintenance level resumption. She listened with the complete, patient attention she brought to significant information, not the performing of listening, but the actual reception of it. the internal processing visible in the specific quality of her stillness. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You rode for 3 days. Yes. With 3 riders and a seer. Not a diplomatic team. Not a formal delegation. No. Why not? He looked at her with the expression she had not seen on his face in the presentation circle. Not the controlled authority of a man making an example, but something open and undefended that had not been there before, or that she had not had the proximity to see. Because a diplomatic team would have implied that what I had to say to you was official business. It is not official business. She studied him. What is it? It is an apology that I am not going to offer you as a condition of asking you to return. The apology is not contingent on the rift. It existed before I knew about the rift, from the moment Voss told me what she told me. And it will exist after whatever happens with the rift is resolved. He stopped, reorganized. What I said in the presentation circle was wrong. What I caused, the laughter, the classification, the cascade of it, was wrong. I am telling you this before I ask you anything, so that you understand the sequence. Nara was quiet for a long moment. She had prepared, in the 10 days since leaving, for several versions of this encounter. The formal version with the diplomatic team, and the official request framed in the language of national necessity. The version in which he arrived alone, and made the apology, and the request simultaneously in a way that made them indistinguishable from each other. She had not prepared for the version in which he separated them with the specific, deliberate care of someone who understood that conflating them would make both dishonest. She picked up the stone she had set down, carried it to the foundation area, set it in its place. Then she turned to face him. Do you want me to come back? Yes. Tell me why. She looked at him steadily. Not the rift. Not the Eastern Territory. Not the 10-day window. Tell me why you want me to come back. The construction site was very quiet. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and this time what came out was not the prepared version. Not any of the drafts he had assembled in 3 days of writing, but something that arrived from a location in him that the 3 days of reckoning had reached and the drafts had not. He did not sleep that night. This was the second consecutive night without sleep, which meant the physical discomfort of it had moved past the acute stage into something more ambient, a background tiredness that colored everything without dominating anything. The specific fatigue of someone who has been sustaining a significant interior effort and whose body has accepted that rest is not currently the priority. He had taken a room at the village's inn, a simple place whose proprietor had received 4 unexpected guests with the practical hospitality of someone who understood that unexpected guests with horses paid for rooms, and that rooms were worth having paid for. The room was small and had a window that faced east. And he was sitting at the small table beside it because the bed had been tried and found insufficient to the task of producing sleep. He was thinking about the presentation circle, not the strategic context that had shaped his decision in the moment, the council members in the gallery, the criticism of the appointment process, the calculation that a visible rejection of an undetectable gift served the political purpose of demonstrating rigor. He had been over that architecture in the 3 days of writing and had found it coherent in its own terms and entirely, completely beside the point. The fact that the decision had been strategically rational did not make it less wrong. The calculation had been made correctly within a framework that was wrong, and the framework's wrongness was not something the calculation's correctness could address. He was thinking about the moment itself, the sentence, the laughter. He tried to locate, with honest precision, what he had felt in the moment of saying it. The court had been watching. The council members had been watching. He had looked at a woman standing in a circle designed to contain supernatural energy output, whose gift had produced no measurable output. Whose gift, he now understood, produced no output because it was entirely specifically, architecturally devoted to containment rather than release. He had looked at her and he had seen, in that moment, only what the instruments saw, nothing. He had not asked what she felt. He had not asked what the practice required or what the 3 hours involved or whether there was a mode of supernatural engagement that his instruments were not designed to detect. He had looked at the absence of output and concluded the absence of gift, and he had said so, publicly in the specific, carrying voice of a man whose public statements had the weight of formal assessment. The laughter had not surprised him in the moment. He had released it. In some sense, had offered the court the shape of a joke, and the court had completed it. This was the peace he had been sitting with for 3 days, and sitting with again now. In the small room with the eastward window, he had known, in the moment of phrasing the sentence, that the phrasing was designed to produce laughter. The cold precision of it, a woman who sits very still in the dark and calls it a contribution, was not an assessment. It was a performance. He had performed contempt for a gallery that needed to see rigor. And she had been the instrument of the performance, and he had not asked anything about her first. He had not asked her anything at all. He pulled the single piece of documentation he had brought from Voss's table from his coat, a single sheet. The deterioration timeline, with the date of cessation marked at its top. He had been looking at this sheet intermittently for 3 days without looking at the date directly. The way you avoid looking at something that will require you to fully receive it. He looked at it now. The date was the night of the presentation. The night he had said what he had said. The night she had walked out of the ceremony hall, and then out of the kingdom. The correlation was not ambiguous, and had never been ambiguous. Voss had stated it plainly, and he had received it plainly, and had been not looking at the plainness of it for 3 days. The seal had failed the night he made it impossible for her to maintain it. He was responsible for the rift's opening, not by the mechanism of any malicious intent. He had not known what she was, had not known what the 3 hours were, had not known that the instrument assessment's failure was the assessment's failure rather than hers. The not knowing did not change the causation. It only described the specific character of the failure, not cruelty but inattention, not malice but the specific, comfortable blindness of a man whose world was large enough that he could dismiss something without examining it and not feel the consequence until the consequence arrived with a head seer's evidence and a deteriorating seal. He had stood in the presentation circle and called her invisible, and she had believed him. And she had stopped pressing, and the door had begun to open. He stood from the small table and crossed the room to the door. Stood outside it for a long time. Her room was at the corridor's other end, a light still visible beneath its door. He knocked. 3 times, quietly, the knock of someone who was not certain of their welcome and was not going to pretend to be. The light beneath her door did not move for a moment. Then he heard the specific sound of someone rising from a chair and crossing a small room, and the door opened. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with the clear, assessing attention that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at things. Not cold, not warm, precise. He had come to tell her what was true rather than what was adequate, because adequate was not available to him for this. Not with warmth, not yet, and she was not going to perform a warmth she had not arrived at yet, but with the specific, considered extension of space that she offered to things she had decided were worth receiving. She moved to the room's single chair and left the bed's edge for him, which was the only available configuration in a room of this size. And he sat on it with the unhurried acceptance of someone who has decided that the terms being offered are the correct terms for the situation. The lamp on the table between them was low, enough light to see by. Not enough to make the conversation feel more formal than it was. She had been sitting with the lamp at this level before he knocked, not reading, not working. Simply sitting in the specific quality of wakefulness she had been maintaining since crossing the border. The interior alertness of someone whose most significant nightly occupation has been removed and whose consciousness has not yet redistributed the attention it used to spend on the practice. She had been thinking about the door. "Ask me what you came to ask," she said. He looked at her with the open expression that had arrived during their conversation at the construction site and had not left since. The specific, undefended quality of a man who has decided that the armor is inappropriate for the current circumstances and has taken it off, not dramatically but simply, as a practical adjustment to a situation that requires something the armor does not permit. "Tell me what you do," he said. "Not the summary, not the version that fits in a presentation circle. What it actually is, what the 3 hours are." She looked at him for a moment, measuring the question, measuring him. Performing the specific internal assessment she brought to all significant decisions. Is this the right listener? Is this the right moment? Is this a genuine request for understanding or a request for information that will be used for a purpose other than the understanding itself? She decided. She told him. Not the managed version she had developed over years of partial explanations to people who did not fully want to hear. The full version, delivered with the precision of someone who has been waiting for the right context without knowing they were waiting. She told him about the extension, the specific, directional reaching that happened when she closed her eyes and began the practice, the way it moved east with compass certainty, the way it found the door regardless of her physical location. She told him what the door felt like, massive, cold, vibrating with a pressure that was not mechanical but had the quality of intention, the specific patient purposefulness of something that had been pressing for a very long time and had not given up. She told him what the pressing cost, the 3 hours of sustained intention, the specific exhaustion that followed, the way she had organized her entire life around the practice's requirements without ever being able to explain the organizing to anyone. She told him about the 17 years and what 17 years of nightly expenditure felt like from the inside, not dramatically, not with the emotional framing of grievance, but with the plain precision of someone providing accurate information about a system they know better than anyone alive. He listened. This was the thing she had not expected from him and had not prepared for, the specific quality of his listening. Not the managed attention of someone processing information for subsequent action. Not the performed engagement of someone demonstrating that they were taking her seriously. He was receiving what she said with the complete, still presence of someone who had decided that receiving it fully was more important than any other thing they might do with the time. His eyes did not move from her face. He did not shift or adjust or make the small preparatory movements of someone whose mind is composing a response while the other person is still speaking. He simply listened. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "When you were in the presentation circle," he said. The question was careful, constructed with the specific precision of someone who has decided they want an honest answer and understands that the framing of the question affects the answer's honesty. "When Trell's instruments were running and you were in the circle, were you pressing?" "Yes, every moment." He looked at the table, then back at her. "The instruments found nothing. The instruments were not designed to find what I do." A pause. "The absence of detection is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a detection instrument's limitations." He received this without deflecting it. She watched him receive it, the specific, honest acknowledgement of a man sitting with a principle that, applied to the decision he had made in the presentation circle, produced a conclusion he could not avoid. "The thing on the other side," he said. "You told Aldrich, the seer, that it has been aware of you, that it waits. It has been aware of me the entire time. It knows my specific quality of intention. It responds to my distress." She looked at him steadily. "It knew before I knew that the presentation was the event that would stop me." He was very still. She watched him sit with the implication of this, the door's awareness, the specific targeting of the humiliation. The possibility that the event in the presentation circle had been not only his failure, but something the thing on the other side had been patient enough to wait 17 years to produce. "There is something else," she said. "Something I understood the night I stopped pressing, when I was in contact with the door for the last time." He waited. "The thing on the other side knows I am gone, and it has been responding to the absence not with urgency, not with the maximum pressure I would have expected from something that has been sealed for 3 centuries and has finally found the seal lifted. It has been responding with patience." She paused. "It is not trying to force the door open quickly. It is allowing the deterioration to proceed at the rate that the absence produces naturally." She looked at him across the lamp's low light. "It is not trying to escape. It is trying to exhaust me into not returning." The silence in the room was the fullest silence she had inhabited since she had stopped pressing. The council session convened on a Monday. Petra Vane had called it with the specific, efficient urgency of someone who had identified a problem, assessed its variables, and arrived at a solution she intended to implement before the variables changed. She had been the kingdom's supernatural security director for 20 years, which was long enough to have developed the particular institutional metabolism of someone for whom every significant event was primarily a security problem, and security problems were primarily resource problems, and resource problems were primarily solved by securing the resource. The session was not officially on the Supernatural Emergency Council's calendar. It was a working session of the Security Committee, 5 members, all with security clearances sufficient for the information being discussed. All individuals whose professional formation had given them the same organizing value that Vane's had given her. National security first. Everything else was a subsequent consideration. She had presented the Voss report in full. The timeline, the deterioration rate, the anchor gifts identification, the correlation to the presentation ceremony. She had presented it without editorial framing, which was her professional default and which, in this case, was also the most persuasive approach. The facts, laid out with clinical precision, communicated the urgency without requiring her to perform it. Then she had presented the problem. The anchor gift was specific to Nara Vell's bloodline. This was not an assessment she had made lightly or quickly. She had spent 3 days consulting the kingdom's supernatural genealogy records, the historical documentation of previous anchor lineages, and the technical analysis of the rift's sealed state signature that Voss had assembled over 40 years of study. The conclusion was unambiguous. The anchor gift was heritable, specific to a bloodline that Voss's records traced to the original sealing 3 centuries ago, and was not transferable, replicable, or trainable in individuals outside that lineage. Nara Vell was the current expression of that lineage. She was singular in the most operationally significant sense of the word. A singular resource that had demonstrated, within the past 10 days, that it was capable of removing itself from service. Vane had let this sit in the room for a moment before continuing. The state necessity declaration was a provision she had known about theoretically for her entire career and had never anticipated using. It existed in the kingdom's legal framework as a mechanism for binding individuals to state service on the basis of singular irreplaceable necessity, crafted originally for a situation involving a navigator whose knowledge of a specific sea route was the only available route during a wartime blockade. Expanded by legal precedent over the centuries to cover any situation in which a specific individual's contribution was both irreplaceable and critical to the kingdom's survival. The application to Nara Vell was textbook. She was irreplaceable. Her contribution was critical. Her demonstrated capacity for voluntary cessation, for simply stopping, for making a personal decision that produced a national security crisis, made her continued voluntary participation an insufficient guarantee of the kingdom's safety. The state necessity declaration would bind her to the practice, not to the palace, not to a specific location. She could continue her life in whatever form she chose. But the practice itself, the 3 hours, the maintenance of the rift's seal, would become a legal obligation rather than a personal choice. Failure to perform would constitute a criminal offense under the declaration's terms. The binding was permanent. Councillor Marsh had asked the obvious question, what was the king's position on this? Vane had said, the king is currently pursuing the subject across the border. His position when he returns will be whatever the evidence and the situation require it to be. She had said this with the calm confidence of someone who understood that the king's personal feelings about a specific Omega were a sentiment, and sentiments, in the presence of sufficient national security necessity, became secondary considerations. The declaration had been drafted by the committee's legal staff over the following day. It was precise, thorough, and legally unassailable under the kingdom's existing framework. It was sealed and dispatched to the border region by the fastest courier available, with instructions to deliver it to the field seer accompanying the king's party and to await the king's response. In the village 3 days across the border, the courier arrived on a Wednesday evening and found Aldred at the inn where the king's party was staying. Aldred read the declaration's cover document in the inn's common room and then held it for a moment, in the specific way of someone deciding how to carry something they did not want to be carrying. She had gone to the king's room first. He had not been there. She had found him, eventually, at the construction site at the village's eastern edge, where he was sitting on a low wall in the dark watching the eastern horizon in the way she had seen him watching it for 3 evenings now, not with the alertness of someone looking for something, but with the specific, quiet attention of someone who is learning how to look. She had given him the declaration. He had read it in the site's dim light. His expression moving through a sequence she had observed enough of in the past several days to read with reasonable accuracy. When he finished, he had folded it once and put it in his coat pocket and said nothing. She had returned to the inn. In Nara's room, at the end of the corridor, the lamp was still on. Aldred had passed the door and paused and then knocked. Because the declaration's second copy was addressed to Nara, and the addressing meant she had a right to it regardless of any other consideration. Nara had opened the door and taken the document with the specific, careful attention she brought to all significant things, and read it standing in the doorway with the lamplight behind her. Her expression did not change as she read. It did not need to. The document said what it said with perfect clarity, and its clarity was its own form of statement about what the kingdom thought she was. She was at the construction site before dawn. Not working. The site did not open until the second hour of morning, and it was not yet the first, but sitting on the same low wall where Aldred had found Kate in the previous evening, with the state necessity declaration on her knee and the eastern horizon doing what eastern horizons did before dawn, holding the specific, patient darkness that preceded light without rushing toward either condition. She had read the declaration 4 times, not because it was unclear, because she had learned, from years of working in records, that documents repaid multiple readings with the specific dividend of revealing, on the 3rd and 4th pass, the things they communicated between their stated intentions, the assumptions embedded in their structure, the values implicit in their framing, the picture of the person they were addressed to that the drafters had in their minds when they wrote. The picture in the state necessity declaration structure was unambiguous. She was a resource, a singular, irreplaceable, critical resource whose personal decisions constituted a national security risk, and whose voluntary participation was therefore insufficient protection against the risk her own autonomy posed. The declaration did not say this in these words. It said it in the specific, careful language of legal necessity, which was in some ways more revealing than blunt statement. You could see, in the construction of the argument, exactly how the drafters had thought about her, not as a person whose gift the kingdom needed, as a system component whose removal had produced a system failure. The sun was beginning to consider the horizon when she heard his footsteps on the site's gravel approach. He had clearly not slept either. He stopped beside the wall and did not sit, stood at a slight distance, in the specific positioning of someone who has decided to let the other person determine the configuration of the encounter. He had the declaration in his hand, the same folded document Aldred had delivered, and he set it on the wall beside hers without comment. 2 copies of the same document, side by side on a low wall in the pre-dawn dark. She looked at them for a moment. "Vane drafted this without your instruction," she said. "Not a question." "Yes. But under your framework, under the kingdom's legal structure, under the provisions you have the authority to invoke or revoke." "Yes." She looked at the horizon. "Then you need to understand what I am going to say to you before I say it. I am not going to return to the kingdom under a state necessity declaration. I am not going to return under any instrument that characterizes my practice as a legal obligation rather than a choice. If the rift seals while I am bound to seal it, the sealing means nothing, not to me, and eventually not to the kingdom, which will have created a precedent that the next anchor, and the one after that, will have to live inside." She turned to look at him. "I will not do that." He was quiet. He received this with the stillness she had come to recognize as his genuine mode of receiving significant things. "I will revoke it," he said, "before I return. Formally. Publicly. With the revocation entered into the official supernatural registry as a permanent record." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "That is the first condition. The second is a formal public acknowledgement of the presentation ceremony, not a procedural correction, not an administrative reassessment. A personal acknowledgement, signed by you, entered into the official court record, stating clearly that the assessment was wrong, and that the anchor gift is real, and that it has been the kingdom's most critical supernatural service for at least 17 years. He did not flinch from this. "Yes." The third condition is the Anchor Recognition Act, a formal legal framework, drafted with my direct input, establishing the rights and protections of anchor practitioners and all individuals whose gifts operate below the kingdom's official detection threshold. It will include a provision that no such individual can ever be bound under a state necessity declaration, regardless of the necessity's scale. She paused. "I will draft the provision myself." He looked at her for a long moment. The dawn was beginning in earnest now. the eastern sky moving through the specific transition from dark to gray that preceded color. And in the growing light his expression was the open, undefended one she had come to trust as his genuine face. "Is there a fourth condition?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, when I return and resume the practice, I resume it as a free person making a free choice, not as the anchor serving the kingdom, as Nara Vell, who has a gift she has chosen to use on terms she has negotiated for herself." She looked at the two declarations on the wall. "The kingdom does not own my gift. It never did. The gift existed before the kingdom had any awareness of it, and it would continue to exist if the kingdom stopped existing. What the kingdom is, being offered is my choice to give it. The difference between those two things is everything." He was silent for a long time. The construction site was still around them, the village not yet awake. The eastern horizon completing its transition from gray to the first pale gold of morning. "And if I agree to all of this," he asked finally, "will you come back?" She looked at the horizon, felt the door in the east, still, and beneath the stillness the faint, terrible suggestion of movement she had been feeling for days, the slow, patient deterioration of something that had been held and had been released, and was now proceeding at the rate that patience and absence produced. A long pause, longer than the question strictly required. "I will consider it," she said. But she was already calculating the timeline. "Rove, I will continue with the next scene only after your reply." She had not told him the night before, though the answer had been present since the pre-dawn conversation at the construction site, because the night before the return required something she had not yet done, and could not do with the answer already given and the direction already set. The answer would change the quality of the night. She needed the night to be what it needed to be before it became the night, before a decision. She waited until the village was quiet, until the inn had settled into the specific, deep stillness of a small building in a small village, where the dark was genuine and uncontested. Then she closed her eyes and extended. The experience was not what she expected. She had expected the door as she had always known it, the massive, cold, vibrating presence, the pressure on the other side, the specific quality of a sealed threshold that required her intention to remain sealed. What she found instead was the door as it was now, after 10 nights of absence, changed. Not fundamentally altered, not transformed beyond recognition, but changed in the way that a wound changes when the pressure holding it closed has been removed and the wound has had time to begin expressing what was inside it. The door was moving. Not dramatically, not the violent, urgent opening of something that had been waiting for this moment and was forcing itself through. The movement was slow, patient, measured, the specific, deliberate pace of something that was not rushing, because rushing would produce a reaction and patience would produce a result. The thing on the other side had been pressing for 3 centuries. It understood patience with the authority of genuine experience. She pressed. The intention that arose was different from the intention she had been producing for 17 years. And the difference was immediately, physically apparent. She had been pressing from obligation, the specific, automatic compliance of someone who had taken on a responsibility before they were old enough to choose it, and had been continuing out of the momentum of commencement rather than the clarity of choice. The intention had been real, and the effect had been real, and the practice had been genuinely performed. But its foundation had been the absence of an alternative rather than the presence of a decision. Tonight she pressed from a different foundation. She had spent 10 days not pressing. She had spent 10 days being a person without the practice. Walking through a village carrying stones, sitting in a small room with a lamp. Talking to a king who had ridden 3 days to find her, and was sitting on a low wall in the pre-dawn dark with a revoked declaration in his hand. She had spent 10 days discovering that she was a person, not just the anchor, not just the practitioner of the 3 hours, not just the woman who sat still in the dark. A person with conditions and requirements and the specific, newly understood capacity to negotiate from a position of genuine power. The pressing that arose from this foundation was different in quality from anything she had produced in 17 years. It was not stronger exactly. Strength was not the variable that had changed. It was cleaner, more precise, less encumbered by the specific, low-level resentment of someone doing an obligatory thing, and more fully expressive of the actual intention, which was this: I am choosing to hold this door. Not because I have to, Because I have decided to. The door responded. The movement stopped. The slow, patient deterioration that had been proceeding for 10 nights arrested with an immediacy that told her, more clearly than Voss's documentation had told her, how much the practice's quality mattered, how much of the seal's integrity depended not just on the intention's presence, but on its character. Obligation had worked. Choice worked better. She held the door for the full 3 hours. When she came back to the room and her own body and the lamp burning low on the table, she sat quietly for a moment in the specific, familiar tiredness of the practice's completion and felt, for the first time in 10 nights, the interior quiet of someone who has done the thing their nature requires. Then she found the foundational point. It was there as she had felt it on the previous contact. 10 nights ago, the specific location in the door's structure, deep at its foundation, where something was different. Not weak. She understood now with the closer attention of choice-based pressing, rather than obligation-based pressing. Not a vulnerability. A hinge. A point at which the door was not just holdable but closable. Permanently, finally. In a way that would not require maintenance, because it would not require a door at all. She examined it carefully. She understood what it would take. She opened her eyes. The lamp was nearly out. The room was dark and very quiet. Outside her door, in the corridor, she heard the specific sound of someone shifting position, the careful, minimal movement of someone who has been very still for a long time and has reached the limit of stillness. She crossed the room and opened the door. Caden was sitting on the corridor floor with his back against the wall, his knees drawn up, his eyes open and alert in the way of someone who had not been sleeping, but had been present, keeping watch in the specific, unasked way of someone who had decided that being outside her door, while she did the most significant thing she had done in 10 days, was the correct place to be. He looked up at her. She looked at him. "I found something," she said. She led him into the room. He came in and sat where he had sat before, on the bed's edge, at the configuration the room's size required, and she lit a fresh lamp and sat in the chair and told him what she had found with the specific, precise attention of someone reporting a discovery that requires accurate transmission. "The door has a foundational structure," she said. "I have always experienced it as a single thing, a barrier, a threshold, something to press against. I have been treating it as static, something that exists and requires maintenance to remain closed." She looked at the lamp's flame, organizing the language for something she had only understood in the last hour. "It is not static. It has a structure, and at the foundation of that structure there is a point, a specific location, where the door is not just maintainable. It is closable." He was very still. "Closable how?" "Permanently." She looked at him. "Not sealed in the sense that I have been sealing it, the ongoing pressure of nightly maintenance. That keeps it closed indefinitely but requires continuous renewal. Closed in the sense of resolved. The breach that created the rift 3 centuries ago produced a door because a breach produces a threshold between what is and what is not. If the breach itself is addressed at its foundational point, if the intention is directed not at holding the door but at dissolving the breach, the door ceases to exist because the condition that created it no longer exists. He processed this with the focused attention she had come to rely on. "What does it require?" She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer required precision, and she was not going to soften it into approximation. "Everything. Not everything in the sense of a cost that diminishes me. I do not think it destroys me. But everything in the sense of the full, undivided, maximum intensity expression of the gift, directed at a single point. Sustained for a duration I cannot predict, but that my sense of the foundational structure suggests will be significant. The maintenance practice uses a fraction of what the gift can produce. The permanent sealing would use all of it." She paused. "I have been running at partial capacity for 17 years without knowing there was a full capacity. Tonight I felt the full capacity for the first time. It is considerably larger than what the nightly practice requires." He looked at her with the specific, careful attention of someone who is not going to tell her what to do with this information. She noted the absence of the directive impulse, the way he held the discovery without immediately converting it into a plan that centered his needs, and noted it as significant. "What happens to you?" he asked. "After?" "I do not know precisely. I know that the gift does not leave. The permanent sealing would be the most complete expression of it, not its consumption. I know that I would be changed in ways I cannot fully predict. I know that the specific, narrow focus of the practice, the 3 hours, the nightly maintenance, the constant background awareness of the door's location, would end, because the door would no longer exist. She looked at her hands. I have had the door in my awareness since I was 7 years old. I do not know who I am without it. He was quiet for a long moment. You do not have to do this, he said. The maintenance practice is sufficient. The rift can be sealed at the level you have been sealing. You can return and resume, and the kingdom is protected, and you are not required to give more than you have already given. I know. Then why are you telling me about the foundational point? She looked at him across the lamp's light. Because I found it. Because it exists. Because the thing on the other side of the door has been aware of me for 17 years, and has been patient for 17 years, and has been waiting, not for a moment of weakness, as I always believed, but for a moment of exhaustion so complete that I would not return. It tried to produce that exhaustion by targeting the one thing that could disrupt my concentration. She paused. It almost succeeded, and it will try again. If not tomorrow, then in a year or 5 years. Or when I am old and the concentration is harder to maintain, and the exhaustion is more permanent than temporary. The maintenance practice is sufficient until it is not. The permanent sealing is sufficient without qualification. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. I am not going to decide tonight, she said. I am going to return first. I am going to resume the practice on the terms I have negotiated. And I am going to stand in front of the supernatural council with the full reality of what the anchor gift is and what it can do. And I am going to make my decision in full knowledge of every available option and in the complete absence of any pressure except my own. He nodded. No argument. No persuasion. The nod of someone who had decided that her process was hers to determine. What can I do? He asked. She looked at him. You have been doing it, she said. Stay outside the door. The council chamber had been arranged for maximum institutional formality. This was Vane's doing. She had managed the session's logistics with the specific, practiced efficiency of someone who understood that formal arrangement communicated authority, and that authority, in a situation this contested, was a resource to be deployed through every available channel. The full supernatural council occupied the long table, with the security committee's 5 members in the positions of greatest visual prominence. The detection instruments, recalibrated, Aldred had confirmed, to attempt the frequency ranges that the Dark Rift's 10 days of active deterioration had finally made measurable, were positioned around the chamber's perimeter. The gallery above was occupied by the senior members of the kingdom's administrative and political infrastructure, present because Vane had understood that the hearing's outcome needed witnessed legitimacy. The State Necessity Declaration, technically revoked by Caden's formal instruction 2 days prior and entered into the official supernatural registry, as Nara had required, was nonetheless present in the documentation on the table in front of Vane, a procedural reminder. Its presence communicating without explicit statement that revoked was not the same as permanently unavailable. Nara stood on the chamber floor. She had been in this position before, in a different chamber, in a different circle, and she had stood in that circle with the full intention of her practice running and the instruments finding nothing. She stood now without the circle's inlaid stone beneath her feet. The chamber had no containment design. Because the Supernatural Council's chamber was designed for deliberation rather than assessment, and she stood with the specific, grounded steadiness of someone who had spent the past several days in the complete, honest reckoning with what she was, and had emerged from it with a clarity she had not possessed before. Vane opened. The argument was intelligent, well-constructed, and genuinely motivated by the concern it claimed to be motivated by. Nara had read the full security committee's documentation and had made herself understand it honestly rather than simply oppositionally, because honest understanding of the argument against her was more useful than the comfort of dismissing it. Vane believed what she was saying. The national security case was real. The irreplaceability was real. The demonstrated risk of voluntary cessation was real. The argument's failure was not in its facts but in its framework, the specific, Limiting premise that a person whose contribution was irreplaceable had therefore forfeited the right to the conditions of their own contribution. Vane finished. The chamber's presiding officer looked at Nara. She did not address Vane's framework directly. She walked to the chamber's center and closed her eyes. The extension moved eastward. She found the door and pressed with the full, choice-based intention of the practice, as she had been performing it since the night in the village 3 days ago. And she pressed not at maintenance level, but at an intensity she had not previously deployed outside the village room's foundational exploration, the fuller expression of the gift, directed at the door with the complete, undivided engagement of someone who is showing rather than telling. The instruments responded. Not immediately. The recalibration had been imperfect, and the instruments were still finding the edges of a frequency range they had been designed to detect only approximately. But within 30 seconds, the needles were moving. Within a minute, every instrument in the chamber's perimeter was registering activity in a range that had no prior entry in the kingdom's detection records, a frequency so specific and so consistent and so clearly directed that the chamber's technical staff, watching the readings with the expressions of people experiencing professional landmark moments, were already reaching for their documentation. She pressed for 3 minutes. Then she opened her eyes. The chamber was very quiet. Vane was looking at the instruments with the expression of someone whose professional framework has just received a significant update, not the collapse of the framework, but the forced expansion of it. The specific experience of encountering evidence that is too clear to be accommodated by dismissal and too significant to be accommodated by the existing categories. Nara looked at the council. What the instruments are showing is the maintenance level of the anchor gift. The level I have been performing every night for 17 years. The level that has been keeping the dark rift sealed. Preventing Class 1 activity, preventing Class 3 incursion events in the Eastern Territory. She paused. The instruments were not detecting this before today, because the instruments were not calibrated. For this frequency range. The frequency range was not in the calibration because no one asked me. What frequency my gift operated at? No one asked me anything. The presiding officer looked at Vane. Vane looked at the instruments, then at Nara. Her expression had moved through its update and arrived at something that was not defeat, but was its near neighbor, the specific, professional sobriety of someone who has been operating on an insufficient picture of a situation and has received the correction. The permanent sealing, Vane said quietly. Is it possible? The question was not rhetorical. It was the question of someone who had built a security infrastructure around a resource and had just learned the resource had a capacity she had not known existed and was recalculating everything. Nara looked at the gallery. She found Caden in it, not at the council table, not in any formal position. Exactly where he had been at every significant moment in the past 2 weeks, present, witnessing, at the same level as what was being witnessed. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Vane. She answered Vane's question. Not immediately, and not in the form Vane had asked it. Not the simple yes or no of a technical capability assessment, but in the full form the question required, which was the form that began before the yes or no, and contained everything that made the yes or no meaningful. I want to tell the council something before I answer that, she said. Not as evidence for the assessment. As the true account of what this council is being asked to make a decision about. The presiding officer indicated she should proceed. She had not prepared this in the way she had not prepared her answer to Caden's question at the construction site, deliberately, because prepared language had a quality of management that the full truth did not survive intact. She was going to say what was true and let it take whatever form it took. I have been the anchor for 17 years, she said. I began at age 7. I did not choose to begin. The gift manifested, and I responded to it the way a 7-year-old responds to something enormous and frightening that is pressing against a door. I pressed back. I pressed back that night, and the night after, and every night for 17 years because the alternative was unthinkable, and because no one in my life had ever suggested that there was a third option between pressing and not pressing. She looked at the council, at the specific faces, the varying registers of attention. I told my mother the morning after the first night. She told me it was a dream. I stopped telling people after that. Not because I was ashamed, but because I understood, at 7 years old. that the experience I was having had no place in any category the adults around me were prepared to receive. I organized my entire life around the 3 hours. Every social decision, every career decision, every relationship I did not pursue because it conflicted with the nightly requirement. I did this without acknowledgement, without support, without any institutional framework that recognized what I was doing or why it mattered. She paused. The kingdom's instruments did not detect my gift for 17 years. The kingdom's assessment process found nothing when I stood in the presentation circle and pressed with my full intention. The kingdom's response to this finding was the public declaration that there was no gift present and the laughter of a court that had been given permission to find the situation amusing. She let this sit in the room for a moment. 3 nights later, the dark rift began to open. The correlation is precise and unambiguous. I stopped pressing because the humiliation made the concentration required impossible. The humiliation was produced by a system that did not know I existed as anything other than an omega presenting an undetectable gift. Because that system had never thought to ask whether the absence of detectable output was evidence of the absence of the gift rather than the absence of the gift itself. She looked at Vane directly. The State Necessity Declaration describes me as a singular, irreplaceable resource whose autonomous decision-making constitutes a national security risk. I want the Council to understand what that framing assumes. That a person whose contribution is irreplaceable has therefore forfeited the right to the conditions of that contribution. That the scale of the need justifies removing the contributor's agency over how and whether they contribute. She shook her head. It does not. The scale of the need makes the contributor's agency more important. Not less, because if the contribution is coerced, you have not secured a willing practitioner. You have created a resentful one. And I have felt, in the past 3 days of resumed practice, the specific difference in quality between pressing from obligation and pressing from choice. The door knows the difference. She looked at the instruments on the chamber's perimeter. Their needles were still because she was not pressing now. But the record of what they had measured 3 minutes ago was in every technical staff member's documentation, and it was not going to leave the room. The permanent sealing is possible, she said. I found the foundational point in the rift's structure during the first resumed contact 3 nights ago. I understand what it requires and what it will cost me and what it will produce. I am willing to do it. A pause. I am willing to do it on one condition, which is that the doing of it is understood and recorded as a free choice made by a free person, not as the performance of a legal obligation or the discharge of a state necessity. If it is done as a gift, the specific, irreversible, complete gift of a person who has chosen to give the full expression of their capacity to a kingdom that did not know what they were giving until it stopped. She reached into her coat and placed a document on the table in front of the presiding officer. I have drafted the Anchor Recognition Act provision myself. As I said I would. It is ready for the Council's review. It establishes the rights and protections of all practitioners with detection threshold gifts. Prohibits the State Necessity Declaration's application to any such practitioner regardless of necessity, and requires that the Kingdom's assessment instruments be recalibrated within 1 year to detect the frequency ranges that current instruments miss. She stepped back. I am asking the Council to revoke the State Necessity Declaration permanently, by formal unanimous vote, before I proceed with the permanent sealing. The chamber was absolutely still. Vane looked at the document. She picked it up and read it with the focused attention of someone assessing a legal instrument, the specific professional engagement that had no performance in it, just the genuine work of someone reading something carefully. When she finished, she set it down. She looked at Nara for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been building a professional case for a specific solution and has just received a better one. I will second the motion, she said. Lord Marsh, seated at the table's center, raised his hand for the vote before the presiding officer could call it. The vote was unanimous. 11 hands, raised without hesitation with the specific, collective quality of a room that has been given permission to do the correct thing and has done it without requiring further persuasion. The State Necessity Declaration was revoked permanently. The revocation entered into the official supernatural registry with the date, the hour, and the basis, the Anchor Recognition Act's Prohibition Clause. now formally adopted as a foundational provision of the kingdom's supernatural legal framework, effective immediately and retroactively. The presiding officer called the session's formal close. Caden rose from the gallery. He came down from it to the chamber floor the way he had come down at every significant moment in the past 2 weeks, without announcement, without the performance of authority, with the specific, deliberate movement of a man who has decided that the floor is where he belongs for what comes next. He stood on it and looked at the council, and then at Nara, who was still standing in the chamber's center with the specific, grounded steadiness she had carried through the entire session. He addressed the council from the floor. The presentation of the gifted, 3 weeks ago, produced an assessment that I delivered publicly and that I delivered incorrectly. He had not brought notes. He had decided, on the road back to the capital from the village 3 days ago, that the formal acknowledgement required by Nara's conditions would not be read from a document. Not because the documentation was unimportant. It was essential. It was one of her non-negotiable conditions. And it had been prepared and signed, and was already in the official court record, but because the documentation could exist alongside the spoken acknowledgement. And the spoken acknowledgement required the specific quality of presence that reading from a prepared text did not produce. The assessment was not a technical error. It was a failure of the framework through which the assessment was conducted. And the framework's failure was my responsibility, because the framework operated under my authority and reflected my administration's assumptions about what a gift looked like and how it could be detected. He looked at the instruments on the chamber's perimeter, the recalibrated instruments that had responded to Nara's contact with the rift 30 minutes ago with the clear, unmistakable readings of a gift that had been present for 17 years and undetected for 17 years. The assumption was that the absence of detectable output was evidence of the absence of the gift. This assumption was wrong, and I enforced it publicly, and the enforcement caused direct harm. He paused. I caused Nara Vell to leave the kingdom. I caused the cessation of the anchor practice. I caused the Dark Rift's deterioration, the Class 1 activity in the Eastern Territory, and the 10-day window of escalating risk that followed. These consequences were not intended. They were, however, caused by my action, specifically, by a sentence I delivered in the presentation circle with full knowledge that it would produce laughter and with no knowledge of what the laughter would cost. He looked at Nara. I did not know what she was. This is true. It is also true that I did not ask. I looked at the instrument's absence of response and concluded the absence of gift without considering whether the instruments might be inadequate to the gift rather than the gift inadequate to the instruments. I made a judgment in the presence of incomplete information, and I made it publicly, and I did not seek the missing information before making it. The chamber was very still. The Anchor Recognition Act is being adopted today with my full endorsement, and the acknowledgement that it should have existed before Nara Vell was ever brought to a presentation circle with instruments that could not detect what she was. The recalibration requirement will be completed within 3 months. Not 12. The formal acknowledgement of the Anchor gift as the kingdom's most critical supernatural service is entered into the official court record as of this morning, with the specific notation that the service was performed continuously for 17 years without institutional acknowledgement, without support, without any compensation except the continuation of the kingdom's safety, which the kingdom accepted without knowing it was being given. He turned from the council to face Nara fully. The gallery was watching. The council was watching. The chamber was the most witness space in the kingdom, and he stood in it and looked at her without managing the expression on his face for any of the watching. I owe you an acknowledgement that the formal record cannot fully contain, he said. You were 7 years old. You pressed because something in you understood that pressing was necessary. With no training and no support and no framework and no one who believed you when you described what you were doing. You pressed for 17 years. You pressed through grief and illness and the specific, accumulated exhaustion of a responsibility that was entirely yours and never shared. You pressed. And the kingdom was safe, and the kingdom did not know it was safe because of you. A pause. I know it now. The council knows it now. The record knows it now. And I am asking you, not as the king asking the anchor, not as the administrative authority asking the state resource, to do what you have chosen to do, in the full recognition of what it is, and what it will cost. And I am asking it as someone who will be in the Eastern Territory when you do it, standing outside the door." The chamber was absolutely silent. Nara looked at him for a long moment with the clear, assessing attention she brought to all significant things. She looked at the council. She looked at the instruments whose needles had moved for the first time in the kingdom's history when she had shown them what she could do. Then she looked back at Caden, at his face in the full light of the chamber with nothing managed and nothing withheld, and she nodded. "Tomorrow night," she said, "at the rift's location. I want to do it at the actual site." He nodded. "I will be there." "Outside the door," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Outside the door." The permanent sealing happened on a Thursday night in the Eastern Territory, at the site of the Dark Rift itself. The site was unremarkable in the way that the most significant places sometimes are: a wide, flat expanse of eastern grassland where the ordinary geography gave no indication of what lived beneath it, except for the specific quality of the air, which Aldred had described to her colleagues as feeling like the air in a room where a very old argument has been going on for a very long time. Nara had felt it differently, like standing next to a door you knew was there and had always known was there, whose familiarity was the most constant relationship of your life. She had sat on the ground at the site's center with her palms flat on the earth and closed her eyes. And Caden had sat outside the perimeter that Aldred had marked, outside the door as he had said, as he had been at every significant moment, and had stayed there without speaking or moving in the specific, sustained presence of someone who has decided that witnessing is the thing required and has committed to it entirely. What happened during the sealing was not something she could describe afterward in any language that was adequate to the experience. She had told Caden this the following morning, when she had finally slept and woken in the Eastern Territory's field station with the specific quality of tiredness that was not depletion but the aftermath of completion, the tiredness of something finished rather than something interrupted. She had told him that the foundational point had been exactly where she found it, that the gift at full capacity was larger than anything she had previously experienced, that the permanent resolution of the breach had felt, from the inside, like the specific, irrevocable satisfaction of a door that does not need to be held because it no longer exists. The rift was closed. Not sealed. Closed. Permanently, completely. In a way that Voss's instruments confirmed within 24 hours with the specific, precise readings of a supernatural fracture that had been resolved at its foundational structure and had left no residual pressure, no deterioration potential, no requirement for future maintenance. 3 centuries of the kingdom's most critical vulnerability ended. What Nara had not anticipated was the expansion. The gift had not diminished. It had opened, the specific, narrow focus of 17 years of rift-directed practice dissolving into a broader, more distributed sensitivity that she spent the following weeks learning to understand. She could feel the fabric of the physical world the way she had always felt the rift's door, not just the Eastern Territory, not just the specific site, but the entire kingdom's geography, its points of thinness, its places where the boundary between what was and what pressed against it required attention. Not urgently, not in the way the rift had required attention, more like the way a gardener feels a garden, with the general, distributed awareness of someone responsible for a large and living system, most of which was fine and some of which, from time to time, needed the specific thing she could provide. The Anchor Institute opened in the Eastern Territory 2 years after the permanent sealing, on the site where the rift had been. Nara had designed it with the specific, hard-won clarity of someone who understood from personal experience what detection threshold practitioners needed and had never been given. The training program was the first of its kind, structured around the practitioner's experience of their gift rather than the instrument's capacity to detect it, beginning with the assumption that the gift was real and the instrument's limitations were the variable requiring adjustment, not the gift. The Equal Supernatural Council included representation from every gift category, regardless of detectability, with the specific legal protections of the Anchor Recognition Act governing all appointments. Vane remained on the council in a position that had been adjusted to reflect the Act's new framework, which she had accepted with the professional equanimity of someone who had updated their framework and was applying the update consistently. Caden sat at the council's center, not the head, the center, a positioning that had begun as a courtesy and had become, over the years, simply accurate. He was most effective when surrounded by the council's full range of voices, and he had learned this the specific, expensive way that people learn things when the cost of not learning them is a dark rift opening in the Eastern Territory. Beside him at the council table was Nara, not the anchor, not the kingdom's most critical supernatural practitioner, not the woman who had sealed the rift. Simply Nara Vell, ecological keeper of the Supernatural Institute, with the full legal standing and the full council authority and the specific, settled clarity of someone who has understood for several years what they are and what they are worth and has stopped accepting anything less than the full acknowledgement of both. Their daughter was 5 years old. She had begun, in the past several months, sitting very still in the evenings with her eyes closed. Not always, not every evening, but with the specific, increasing frequency of something that was becoming habitual, a practice finding its practitioner, a gift recognizing the vessel it had been given to. She sat very still with her eyes closed and her small face wearing the expression Nara knew with the intimacy of 17 years. The specific look of someone listening to something no one else in the room could hear. Nara sat beside her daughter on these evenings and did not interrupt and did not hurry and did not tell her that what she heard was not real. She said, "Tell me what you hear." And her daughter told her. And Nara listened the way she had never been listened to, completely, without instruments. Without the assumption that the absence of measurable output was evidence of the absence of the thing. She listened with the full, present attention of someone who understood that the most important things in the world were often exactly the things the world's accounting systems were not designed to see. And she believed every word. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.